Okay then. Hello and welcome to question and answer number 185. I am your host, Panyo Basa, and this is my beverage. And I hope the sound quality will be a little bit better now because I re-downloaded the software for making the microphone sound better. So we'll see how it goes. I still may have to make some adjustments and tweaks and that kind of thing. And I might as well say that 185 is not a prime number. It is in fact 5 times 37, although 37 has always been one of my favorite numbers for obscure reasons. And at the time of recording this, it is the day after joint U.S. and Israeli forces just bombed the hell out of Iran and continue to bomb Iran today. In fact, they're going to continue bombing Iran for many days until Iran has approximately zero ability to retaliate with anything more than pointy sticks. And I guess nobody's asked me about this because it happened so recently, just right before the Q&A started. But I mean, I'm ambivalent, let's say. I mean, from a moral, ethical, Buddhist point of view, of course, war is always just mass murder. So war is always bad from a Buddhist ethical point of view. But one reason why I lost interest in politics many years ago and only recently started getting interested in it again because it really is interesting sometimes is that I realized that what is good and right from an ethical point of view is not necessarily what is good and right from a political point of view. And whether America aiding Israel to bomb the shit out of Iran is a good idea from a political point of view, if it is good and right politically, only time will tell. Trump has been fairly fortunate in his choices thus far. Like Venezuela, I mean, he just arrested the dictator, whom I haven't heard anything about since. He's probably just locked up in a cell somewhere awaiting trial. But who knows? We're just going to have to wait and see if, from a political point of view, America is better off with Iran getting the shit bombed out of it and almost all of its senior leadership just vaporized. And I suppose I should also say that the first few questions in this Q&A are questions that I somehow overlooked previously. So these are at the top of the list because they were asked at least a week ago. I think Romeo's one of his questions, I think, was asked like 2 or 3 weeks ago, and I just somehow overlooked it. I just kind of spaced it off or, just scrolled past it. Sometimes I'm going down the scroll, it's on the list, and I just scroll past it accidentally somehow. So anyways, the first question is from Yoshi Bui. And Yoshi Bui says, the block of marble that contains all possibilities, all possible versions of you, is that similar to the idea of a parallel universe? And of course, he's referring to my simile of the block of marble, which is like my theory of everything. It's kind of like the Buddhist theory of everything is dependent co-arising. And dependent co-arising is sort of contained within the block of marble. So there's definitely overlap. But my theory of everything, of like the universe existing and why it is the way it is and all that, is you've got this infinite formless consciousness, let's say, and contained within this formless infinity is every possibility. It's all in there. And it takes dependent co-arising and perception, sort of self-reflexive statues contained within the block of marble to kind of create samsara. various cosmos, various phenomenal universes. So anyways, Yoshibui is asking if this idea is similar to the idea of a parallel universe. And yeah, I mean, it would be sort of like the maximum of the many worlds hypothesis, which some scientists take seriously. It would just have every possible universe contained within it, which would be some parallel universes and some universes that are just going off at a complete tangent. They're not really parallel at all. They're just going like perpendicular or something. So yeah, it would contain parallel universes, but it would contain universes like alternate universes that aren't really running parallel. Just starting off with just completely different laws of physics, for example, just maybe even no laws of physics, just something else that is stabilizing the system. I mean, you could have entire universes of like pulsating, like geometrical figures, this kind of thing, that somehow are like recursive or self-referential enough that they become delusional and create a samsara for themselves. So I think I've answered that question more or less, kind of. And I'm just going to move on to Romeo, who has asked 4 questions here, but it's not really transgressive because one of the questions was asked a few weeks ago, and I just didn't notice it until recently. So, Romeo says, in all likelihood, you have heard the demographic projections that white people will soon become a minority in the U.S. Not only will white Americans be a minority, but they may even be a persecuted minority at that. Besides this, eventually, large swathes of the U.S. may not even be English-speaking. The signs are all there. There's the recent all-Hispanic Bad Bunny Super Bowl appearance, performed totally in Spanish, or New York City Mayor Zoran Mamdani openly targeting white neighborhoods for higher taxes. Then there's this video clip circulating of a state representative in Houston, Texas, calling for Asian, Black, and Hispanics to find common cause and unite to take down white people. I was wondering what your general take is of the demographic future of the U.S. and what it bodes for white Americans. Will white Americans eventually become a persecuted minority akin to the whites in post-apartheid South Africa? I'm a regular English-speaking white American who has nothing against other ethnicities and cultures. Do you have any suggestions for someone like me to not be black-pilled about this likely future and to accept it with equanimity? So I guess there's a number of questions contained within this question, isn't there? There's a number of question marks. So let's see here. First, he's talking about sort of like white replacement theory. I can't remember. There was some half-Japanese aristocrat like 100 years ago who had this theory that is named after him, and I can't remember his name right offhand. But it's kind of replacing white people partly because white people don't behave like the global norm. I mean, we're too like freedom and originality oriented, for example. And so we don't make easily, I mean, we're not sheep-like enough as general. I mean, everybody's pretty sheep-like. The human race in general has got sheep instincts. But the European race or sub-race or ethnicity, family of ethnicities, whatever you want to call your people of European ancestry, there's just something about us that makes us more interested in human rights, freedom, originality, individuality, that kind of stuff, which just kind of throws a monkey wrench into the globalist agenda to some degree. And so I assume that's a major reason why it has been a part of the globalist agenda to just eliminate white cultures through dilution, if through nothing else. So let's see, let's get down to the question marks here. See, I was wondering what your general take is of the demographic future of the U.S. and what it bodes for white Americans. Well, I mean, it's a common mistake to take a trend that exists now and just extrapolate it into some inevitability, whereas usually that doesn't work very well because, I mean, you see a car heading towards a brick wall. You can extrapolate, well, the car is going to hit the brick wall, but as a general rule, people turn the car before they get to the brick wall. Every once in a while, the car really will hit the brick wall, but usually the driver of the car steers the car so that it doesn't ram into the brick wall. And there is some of that involved in this, in that just because the trend is going in that direction now does not mean that there will be course corrections, so to speak. So, I mean, even now, with Trump as president, you've got actual negative immigration going on for the first time in many decades. I mean, if it has ever been the case in America before that we had negative immigration, where there's more people leaving the country than entering, and it's not so much like disgusted, pissed off leftists. I mean, there's some of those, and like they tend to regret it after leaving. They don't realize what a good country America is to live in until they go to the UK or Canada or someplace, and then it's even worse. So, I mean, who knows? It could be 50 years from now, there's going to be a race war or something. And that could just really change things. But the thing is, Westerners, I mean, we are creative, innovative, to some degree unpredictable. We tend to win wars. That's why Western civilization has taken over the entire world. I mean, you go to other countries that are opposed to Western civilization, let's say China, for example, and they're wearing Western clothes and they've got driving Western style cars, using Western style technology, you know, just Western style pretty much everything, except for the language they're speaking and some of their vestigial customs. Even their like politics is based on Western politics now. And there's reasons for that. And so, I mean, people of European ancestry are better at European, like, global culture now because we invented it. It's more in tune with our psyche, you know, our human nature, our version of human nature or whatever. So, I mean, we will tend to outcompete competitors. And that's like on the international scale and also within the country itself, that what's likely going to happen is what's already happening now, where you've got like white people fleeing places like New York City that are becoming increasingly anti-white people, and they're accumulating in more Republican-run places, Florida, you know, just the Bible Belt of the South in general, just the middle states, the so-called flyover states, that probably you're going to have maybe to some degree a balkanization of the United States. I mean, nothing lasts forever. That's one of the teachings of Buddhism. One of the marks of existence, one of the 3 marks of existence is impermanence. So the United States isn't going to last forever. Rome didn't last forever. I mean, there's still a city of Rome, but the empire is long gone. Even when it was revived as the Holy Roman Empire, it still was just a completely different country. So, I mean, you might have just like enclaves, you know, just sort of white refugees accumulating, and then they're just going to outcompete the other areas as a general rule. You're going to have sort of progressive governments, state governments or whatever, that are going to insist upon diversity, equity, and inclusion. They're going to say, screw meritocracy. That's a tool of white patriarchal oppression. And so they're just not going to be able to compete. They will not compete against, like, Europeans doing the European thing very well. Unless the Europeans just emasculate themselves as they have done in the EU, for example. So, yeah, I don't think that Americans will eventually become a persecuted minority akin to the whites in post-apartheid South Africa, largely because South Africa was always a small minority of the people there, the Boers and the English, the British. It was a relatively small minority so that they can just be overwhelmed. And a lot of them just left after apartheid ended, foreseeing that South Africa was just going to degenerate into a corrupt third world hellhole, which is what it is doing. So, yeah, I don't think the white people in America are going to become a minority in the same way as Zimbabwe or South Africa, something like that. Or Singapore. So, yeah, I'm not black-pilled, and anything is possible. And the universe is always, it's just every possibility is out there, including infinite number of possibilities starting from this point here. So it's going to depend a lot on our own karma, using the English word karma instead of the Pali word kama. And so, just anything that could possibly originate from the current present situation, it's out there. And we're just going to have to navigate that in accordance with our wisdom or lack of same and our karma. So let's see here. Oh, the question continues. Let's see. Do you have any suggestions for someone like me to not be black-pilled about this likely future? Well, being black-pilled is just not a strategy at all. It's certainly not conducive to success. Pretty much the only guaranteed way of failing is just to give up or quit. That's guarantee of failure right there, just to give up. To accept it with equanimity. Well, whatever happens is going to be of your own creation. You're creating the world you live in. It's your own karma has placed you where you need to be in order to work out these latent tendencies and stuff you still need to work on because you haven't learned to work it out perfectly yet. It's like Groundhog Day. Bill Murray had to keep spending the same day over and over until he just got it right. So, yeah, you are creating your own reality, and it may be kind of a harsh, difficult reality. I have to admit, for me personally, 2026 has started off on like a kind of the wrong foot, and it's just continued that way. It's been limping up to the first 2 months thus far. But I have faith in my own karma and just, faith in the gods, the small g gods or some such, that things definitely do have to get better. Sooner or later. So who knows? Maybe, for starters, the Iranians will admit that, they're just going to keep getting bombed into oblivion until they decide to say, all right, okay, we'll try some kind of secular government now and see how that works. Let's see here. Okay, so I guess I answered that one fairly well. Do not be black-pilled. It's just, it is not a winning strategy. It is not conducive to happiness or anything else. Well, I guess it's conducive to something, but not much that is good. So I'm just going to move on to Romeo's next question. These are, I think, his recent questions. So the extra questions that I've already answered are not transgressive, technically speaking. And Romeo says, I went through a lot of trauma growing up as a result of having some pretty unstable, toxic parents. What is your advice on how to accept one's toxic parents as much as possible, despite how much they harmed you over the years, especially when they continue to be toxic? Well, Romeo is a grown man now. He doesn't have to live with his parents. So, from that point of view, the best advice I would give you is be polite, be respectful. You don't have to interact with them any more than is necessary. I mean, it might be, you're going to call them on their birthday, or maybe even come over for Thanksgiving dinner, that sort of thing, and just use it as a spiritual practice. Just being nice, not trying to get sucked into old toxic habit patterns, that kind of thing. Honor thy mother and father, or is the commandment father and mother? Patriarchal system, so maybe it started off with father. Let's see. Yeah, I mean, from the Buddhist point of view, you don't have to be interacting with them all the time. So, if they really are foolish people that are have a negative mental state, have negative effects on you, then the first blessing of the Mangala Sutta, which is a list of blessings, is not associating with fools. Ativalasa balanam in Burmese pronunciation of Pali. So yeah, you just kind of keep it down to a minimum that is not too harsh. I mean, if they're just horrible, if they were, just abusive and so forth, then you might just make a clean break, while at the same time still trying to have metta for them. Forgive them because they know not what they do, that kind of thing. And you can say, some people can be cynical and say, well, they knew what they were doing. But still, people just, they're delusional. And so they kind of know what they're doing, but at the same time, if they knew of something better that would make them happier, they'd probably be doing that. If they just could break free of their habit patterns and so forth. And a lot of abusive parents were abused by their own parents, which causes this vicious circle. My father, his father, Grandpa Reynolds, was a very gentle man. He was an ordained Baptist minister. He was working on his 4th doctorate when he died. He was fluent in Greek and Latin, just a very gentle man. My father saw him not be gentle very few times, and they really stuck in his memory. One time, this was way back when people were still driving horses and buggies, back in the 20s, late 20s. Cars had been invented, but still a lot of people still had horses and buggies. Some guy got his horse tangled up in a barbed wire fence in front of my father's parents' house. And the guy was just whipping that horse. And he was in a frenzy, and the horse was in this frenzy of just terror and pain. And my grandfather, who was normally a very gentle, soft-spoken man, he grabbed a shotgun and he went out there and just told this guy, just in this deathly calm voice, although he was just white and kind of vibrating when he was saying it, but he kept it very calm. And he says, if you whip that horse one more time, I swear to God, I'm going to shoot you. But my father's mother was just a fire and brimstone fundamentalist Christian who firmly believed spare the rod, spoil the child, and my father was just beaten over and over again by his mother. So his mother kind of fathered him, and his father kind of mothered him, which, my father turned out relatively normal. He was relatively healthy, wise, relatively well-adjusted person. He was an alcoholic for many years, for much of his life, maybe half his life. But whether that had anything directly resulting from being beaten by his mother over and over again, I don't know. So, getting back to the actual question, though. I might as well continue with my father, just with regard to the arguably toxic mother. That, he'd still call her and speak to her. He didn't have to live with her anymore, so, he didn't have to put up with very much, and she wasn't much inclined to beat on him when she was in her 70s anyway. But it'd be more like, Jesus is coming. And then my father would say, well, when he comes, tell him howdy for me. And then she'd be saying, you're going to have to tell your own howdies. Well, to some degree, he forgave her. He wasn't really complaining about how he was abused as a child. I mean, it would come up in conversation when he's telling stories about when he was a kid and so forth. But as a general rule, it's just, he kind of accepted that was in his past, and, he's got a different present now and a different future. So, yeah, I guess I'm just going to have to go back to the original answer of, be polite and respectful if that seems appropriate. Have metta in your heart, forgive them as well as you can. But at the same time, if they're still toxic, then keep a safe distance. Maybe just do your duty as a son to show up for Christmas or Thanksgiving and say happy birthday, send a Mother's Day card, that kind of thing. And just kind of keep a safe distance so that you don't get sucked into these sort of toxic habit patterns. That would be my best advice. I mean, if you really wanted to be hardcore in spiritual practice, you could, one of your parents, really needs to have someone taking care of them. You could be like feeding them and wiping their behind and that sort of thing someday. As that would be like advanced spiritual practice, I think. And it's time for me to go on to the next question, also from Romeo. He says, what do you know about the Buddha's parents, especially with regard to their behavior, temperaments, and the way they treated him as he was growing up? Well, all you really know about the Buddha's parents are that, is legend. It's mythology, kind of. So, I mean, the Buddhist parents, you had King Suddhodana, which literally means pure cooked rice. And his mother was Mahamaya, or great illusion, I suppose. And his mother, the queen, or one of the queens, she died when the Buddha was like a week old. I mean, if that really happened, then, it could be complications of childbirth or something. Although I think going with the legend, it was just sort of like this cosmic law that, she did something so tremendous by giving birth to the future Buddha that, I mean, it was like too much for her mortal frame to bear, I guess. And so she died shortly thereafter, kind of like in ancient Greece. If you look upon a god in his full glory, I mean, it's just too much sublimeness. So with regard to his biological mother, I mean, she really did not have much of an impact on his life other than just her absence. His father was, according to legend, a king. The king of Kapilavatthu, which was a small, like a city-state kind of a kingdom, according to legend. Although, I mean, nowadays, the experts, the Indologists, the archaeologists and so forth are saying that, in all likelihood, Kapilavatthu was kind of like an oligarchic republic more than a kingdom. And so some of the Buddhist fundamentalists will try to cobble those together. They'll try to save the theory by saying, well, the Buddha's father was called the king because he was like the senior lead of the oligarchic council of elders that ran the small state, this sort of thing. But, I mean, you go with, like, the legends, and he was just a proud king. He was not like a cruel, sadistic kind of king, but still he was proud. He had lots of mana, and he was really disgusted by his son renouncing kingship in order to go and become a penniless beggar. My father had some similar feelings, although I was never a royal prince in this life. So, their temperaments, behavior, I mean, the Buddha's father, his behavior was kingly, just sort of the stereotypical proud, I mean, a relatively good king, but still, I mean, pride was one of the outstanding personality traits that comes through in the texts. There is one sutta in which the Buddha claims that when he renounced the world to go from the home life into homelessness, his parents stood by grieving, which could be like a relic of like the pre-legend, where it may be that his father and mother were both alive as the Buddha grew into manhood. But again, all we really have is legends. There's also the legend of the Buddha when he was a child sitting under a rose apple tree and learning meditation just spontaneously while his father is plowing a field. And if his father really was a king, there's a good chance he wouldn't be plowing a field, although I think the official explanation for that is that the king was doing some ceremony where he was ceremonially plowing a furrow for, some state reason, and he wasn't really a farmer plowing a field. He was just plowing just this sort of a sacred furrow for some symbolic reason that was required of him as a king. But then the Buddha also had like a stepmother who was his aunt. The Buddha's father, according to tradition, married two sisters, Mahamaya and, let's see, what was her name? Mahapajapati Gautami. So they were all members of the Gautama clan. They were all, let's hope, distant cousins and not first cousins. So yeah, his stepmother, also his aunt, who raised him, although if he was a royal prince, he probably was raised by an army of, nurses and slave women and that kind of thing too. That she was a virtuous woman and had some wisdom, and she was the one who begged the Buddha after his enlightenment to start the order of nuns, and she was the first ordained Buddhist nun. But there's really not a whole lot of emphasis on like the temperaments and personality traits and behavior of the Buddha's parents. It's all legend, and so you just have to kind of take it with a grain of salt. I mean, the only real friction that you see with the Buddha and his father was kind of offended or disgusted by the Buddha renouncing, the throne, first in line for the throne, in order to become literally a penniless beggar. Although he eventually did see the light, I do think he became an Arya after the Buddha returned to his home state and kind of reconciled with his wife and ordained his son Rahula as a monk. And I'm pretty sure, it's been a long time since I've read this, but I do think, according to the legend, according to the sutta, his father took the three refuges and converted to Buddhism. So then he was proud of his son again, I suspect. And I think I'm just going to move on to Romeo's last question here, which is, what advice do you think the Buddha would give about how to deal with toxic parents? And I would guess his advice would be pretty much my original advice in response to two questions above. You should have metta for them. You should forgive them. And but if they really are still toxic, just keep a safe distance as much as you can, while not abandoning your filial duty to at least, be there for them if they need you, that kind of thing. There is the famous statement in the sutta somewhere where the Buddha says that, even if you carried your aged parents around on your back for the rest of your life, you could never fully repay them for having brought you into this world and, produced the person that you are today. Even if they had negative effects and so forth and were abusive, and to some degree you became a good person in spite of them, that still, you are who you are largely because, they're the ones who brought you into the world and your first influences were from them. And even if you became a good person in spite of them, still, you started with that in order to become what you are now. So there is a lot of the kind of the biblical honor thy father and mother in the Ten Commandments, that's kind of built into just about any kind of traditional religious system, including Buddhism. But I would guess that, he would advise that if they really are toxic, foolish, harmful people, that, you should try to, you have to have a certain distance, unless you're just full-blown saint. You're like Alyosha Karamazov in the Dostoevsky novel, where it's like you just plunge right into it. It's just, that is your spiritual, that's the crucible, the spiritual crucible, where you're going to be purified by the holy fire of just self-denial. But you have to do that wisely, because otherwise you just get sucked into these negative habit patterns that are just self-perpetuating and can get even worse. So, you should engage to the extent that you have the wisdom to do that in a positive way. And each person would have to decide that for themselves, or if they lack the wisdom to decide that for themselves, then they should have somebody that they trust who is, knows enough information about the parents and the child and so forth, that they could give some advice as to, how far you should go in performing filial duties without just getting sucked into this toxic habit pattern stuff. But have metta for them at least, And I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Austin. And now we're getting into the recent... No. I guess Austin's last three questions were recent, so never mind. This question is from Austin. And Austin says, would you ever be open to the idea of starting a 501c3 for the purpose of founding a meditation center with yourself as a teacher? It doesn't strike me as being particularly likely. It's theoretically possible that it could happen. Although, I just, something would really have to break. There'd have to be some kind of break in the logjam that has existed since long before I stopped being a monk, with regard to actually making a living in the West as a Dhamma teacher. When I first disrobed, that was kind of like the obvious choice. The thing I was most qualified to be would be a Dhamma teacher, but actually making a living at that is a whole different kettle of wax, so to speak. So, it's theoretically possible, but not extremely likely, in my opinion. Good chance I'll just spend the rest of my life, at least my professional life, running machines, that kind of thing. Which is kind of unfortunate, I guess, but when you just start over from scratch after 30 years of being a monk, and just making a living as a Dhamma teacher, it's theoretically possible. It can happen. It does happen, especially in California, which is a state I would not want to live in. But it's just, there has been like a karmic log jam that has been like an obstacle to that since long before I stopped being a monk. It's just difficult getting support, enough support to live on comfortably. As a layperson, I would need more support than as a monk, just because monks can just live under a tree. And being a layperson that has like a woman and dogs to feed, that kind of thing, fishes, it takes more than just the bare minimum that a monk requires. So, if somebody were to come along, this is pretty much the only way it would happen, is like some eccentric wealthy person just comes along and makes the offer. Then, I'd definitely consider that. But, like, going out and trying to make it happen on my own, I've tried that before, and experience indicates that it'd be more realistic to make a living doing something else. And so I do this as a free public service, just out of the kindness of my heart and a sincere desire to share something of value with yous guys. And so I'm just going to move on to, I might as well say, I mean, just charging money for Dhamma is something that I've always kind of not liked anyway. You know, just the idea of it. You know, Dhamma should be free. It's like priceless. So there's that too. And so I'm just moving on to the next question. This is from Newman. And Newman says, is it bad karma to research Buddhist justifications for war, if not a kind of holy war, for example, the Kala Chakra prophecy or samurai Zen, etc., as well as the more out there tantric step Buddhism, where warlords intermingled with antinomian CDs and then make an informative detached video covering the history and conveying the logic or metaphysics or Buddhist justifications behind those views. Intention, I find it interesting and it could make for cool content, not endorsing it or biased. So this is another one of those questions often asked by people, like, you know, is it bad karma to do this or that action? And again, as I keep saying, until I'm blue in the face, and it might be kind of a slight bluish tint right now, that outward actions are karmically neutral. That the ethical aspect of an action ultimately is the accompanying mental states. So if Newman here wants to research Buddhist justifications for war, you know, to study the history of militant Buddhism and sort of work out the philosophical justifications for it with like a Buddhist slant, you know, the Buddhist justifications, you know, like the samurai Zen warriors, the sword masters, that kind of thing. And also just kind of from his own Buddhist slant, then, I mean, it's not necessarily good or bad. It just depends on, you know, what your motives are, how you feel about what you're doing, how much you're wallowing in delusion, attraction, aversion, and delusion, attraction, aversion, and semi-conscious stupidity. And so, I mean, from the Buddhist point of view, you don't have just pure white and pure black. It's not like the Bible where God commands you to do something. And so doing it is just pure good, and not doing it is pure bad, or doing the opposite is pure bad. I mean, in Buddhism, it's all shades of gray. I mean, you never have pure white or pure black. It's like when you become enlightened, it just becomes like transparent, clear, no longer any color at all. So yeah, I mean, I've kind of looked into it a little bit, like Suzuki Roshi, who was one of the people who brought Buddhism into the American mainstream, mainly through the beatniks in the 1950s. I mean, he was a supporter of Japan and like fascism during World War II. You know, so he did actually put forth arguments sort of justifying like the samurai Zen sword masters, that kind of thing. So it's out there. And it is kind of interesting, I have to admit. I've written on the subject a few times, I think, in my old blog. Also, I was, like, shortly after I came back to America the last time, I was still a monk, a person who was just a self-proclaimed fascist asked me to help as a kind of technical advisor, a Buddhist technical advisor with regard to, I think it was a subreddit he was making with regard to Buddhist fascism, which included, you know, a certain amount of violence. Fascism, you know, one of its stereotypical qualities is it tends to be somewhat militaristic. And, you know, just as a technical advisor, I was cool with that. I mean, I wasn't endorsing violence, but I mean, just kind of helping to explain the situation, you know, just historical attitudes towards it, that kind of thing. I mean, that can be just detached and amoral. So, Is it bad karma to research Buddhist justifications for war, etc.? Not necessarily. It depends on your attitude, what your motives are, that kind of thing. And I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Siovak and Sipad Zidana. And Siovak and Sipad Zidana says, you said David Hume is your favorite modern philosopher. He famously said reason is and ought to be the slave of the passions. Do you agree with this sentiment that reason should be the slave of the passions? Well, whether it should be or not, I mean, it just is. And so if something is a certain way, then it becomes this kind of academic or superfluous to say whether it should be that way. I mean, should rocks be hard? Well, I mean, they are hard as a general rule. So the should, it's like kind of value judgment where, it's like you're deciding, well, rocks shouldn't be hard in my opinion, even though they are hard. I mean, what's the point of that? I mean, it just seems silly. But I do agree with Hume that reason is the slave of the passions because reason cannot initiate anything. I think Kant also agreed with this, that pure reason cannot motivate an action. That it has to be passion that actually causes you to get up in the morning, that actually causes you to do anything. That is ultimately irrational. That's just like in early Buddhism, the spike in the heart that just causes this restless dissatisfaction that makes us want to just remain in motion and keep doing stuff. That reason in and of itself, it doesn't make value judgments. It's like, is it better to get up in the morning or just stay in bed and just not ever get up and just lie there till you're dead? It's not logically necessary that remaining in existence is better than not remaining in existence, or vice versa. One could argue it's like, well, when you're playing chess, that's completely rational, or it can be anyway. But why do you want to play chess in the first place? It's ultimately irrational that any decision you make with regard to doing something is going to be irrational. And then rationality just helps to guide that, largely through just being a bullshit detector and weeding out obviously stupid decisions. Just, should I throw this rock through the window? It's like, well, no, it would break the window. Then I'd have to fix the window. And so it's just reason just helps to weed out that stupid idea. But whether reason should be the slave of the passions or not, it just seems like kind of a silly question because that's just the way it is. Should rocks be hard? And it's kind of that kind of question. So, I'll go along with David Hume. I'll just say, yeah, it should be the slave of the passions because, the passions are what actually motivate behavior. To do something or not to do something, to be or not to be, does not have a rational, necessary answer. Logic cannot, logic itself is ultimately based on irrational premises. The only way you could have pure logic would be to have an infinite regress of premises that you just can't have. At some point, you just have to start with some hopefully self-evident axiom or group of axioms. But just choosing the axioms is itself, to make the choice is itself just not ultimately fundamentally rational. So I'm just going to move on to Siovak and Sipad Zidana's next question. And I don't know how to pronounce this name. It's a French name. La Rochefoucauld. Rochefoucauld? I don't think so. Anyways, this French guy said, "We love neither mother nor father nor wife nor child, but rather the agreeable feelings they give us. Do you agree with this sentiment?" Well, from the Buddhist point of view, ultimately there is no mother or father or wife or child, and no us either, because there is no what's the word? No individual, no distinct, ultimately real individual, no individual self-essence. That's all dependent co-arising. So, I mean, you can't even say that we love the agreeable feelings they give us, because if you get down to the level of no self, all of that's an illusion. So, I mean, if you're just going to be dealing in the samsaric level of illusion, you can say, sure, we love our father and our mother and our wife and our child. And, I mean, if you just break that down into just stimuli, then you could say, okay, there is love for the pleasant feelings or whatever it is, or love out of duty, that kind of thing. For some reason, I keep being reminded of a saying of Lord Byron. George Gordon Lord Byron, famous romantic poet of the early 19th century in England. He said that the first time a woman falls in love, she falls in love with a man. And then every time after that, she just falls in love with love itself. Just the feelings she gets from being in love. You know, she kind of gets, she joneses on that or something. But I mean, at some philosophical level, you could say that, yeah, we don't really love another person. We love the way they make us feel, or the pleasant associations, the pleasant perceptions. Because the only way you know another person is through perceptions, at least from a Buddhist point of view. So, I mean, you're kind of projecting like some being out there that you're aiming your love at, but really, I mean, what it is that's causing you to project the being out there and feel the love and everything is your own perceptions, which are mental states. I mean, you could say that at a very deep level, you know, there is a kind of telepathy, a kind of real empathy that, you know, in the block of marble, there are group statues. And so there can be a kind of group mind. And if there is a kind of group mind, like a deep telepathic bond between people, then you can maybe to some degree bypass just the superficial feelings and just directly kind of love this us entity that you and the beloved person are creating. Let's see. Did I answer the question though? I mean, the main question is, do I agree with this sentiment? And largely I do, but I don't think it's necessarily 100% true. I mean, partly just because there is no us to love anybody either, just going with the strict interpretation of no self. And also, if you get to a little bit more samsaric level, then still there can be like a group mind where you can just bypass the superficial perceptions and just have like this, like a direct communion with another being, which is not Orthodox Buddhism. But still, I do consider it to be possible. And it's largely in agreement with my whole theory of everything, the theory of the block of marble, or the simile of the block of marble. And I'm just going to move on to the next question. This also is from Siovach and Sipad Zidana. He said, based on the previous question, if you answered yes, and I answered pretty much yes, although not entirely 100% yes. He said, if you answered yes, then do you think knowing this, we should be truthful to others about this? For example, when you tell your parents, husband, wife, or kids, we should really say, I love how you make me feel, rather than I love you. If you don't believe in lying, I wonder how far you would go. Well, I mean, if you're taking it at the radical level of no self, then you couldn't even say I or me. So, yeah, I mean, if you get all the way down to like the level of ultimate truth, or as close to the level of ultimate truth as you get, I mean, it's just beyond language. It's anything you say is just going to be samsaric and not ultimately true. With regard to, I love how you make me feel, I mean, that's kind of a romantic thing that you might say to your lover sometimes in addition to I love you. But I mean, if you're dealing at like the level of conventional truth, which is the level of language, then I don't see any problem with saying, I love you. I tell my woman that I love her. I don't think I'm lying just because of these metaphysical or kind of abstract philosophical notions. And sometimes it's like I was mentioning in a previous Q&A, I think it was the previous Q&A, about saying I'm sorry. That, I mean, to some degree, it's like a block of words that convey a sentiment. And I mean, it doesn't necessarily have like a literal adherence to objective truth necessarily. Like even etymology's words, like understanding. I understand this idea. Doesn't mean you're standing under it. So you're using words that don't necessarily mean the literal meaning of the word, if that makes any sense. That just the statement, I love you, is, I mean, it has different meanings to different people. And I don't think you're lying, even if that French guy was right, that technically you don't really love the other person, you loved the way they make you feel. Although, again, I don't 100% believe that. And so, yeah, I see no problem or dishonesty in saying I love you, even if I accept the Buddhist doctrine of no self to be ultimately true. I mean, so long as you're talking, you're not adhering to ultimate truth, because you're relying on these symbols that have more or less vague, ambiguous, approximate meanings based on delusion. So, yeah, I do say I love you. I've even said it to my dogs a few times. So let's just move on to the next question. This is from Fred. And Fred says, how to dig out anusias. And I should check to make sure we are recording. And yeah, we've been going at it for almost an hour. That's good. That would suck if after an hour I look and we're not recording. So Fred's question is how to dig out anusias. And for those of you who aren't into like technical Pali philosophical jargon, an anusia is an underlying tendency. It's like latent karma or latent behavior patterns, latent personality traits that don't come to the surface until a certain situation arises. You know, it's like when I became a monk, I had lots of layperson anusias because I just wasn't hanging out with lay people, especially not American lay people, for years. You know, I'd be just living out in a forest in Burma. The only Burmese people I would meet, or the only lay people I would meet, would be like Burmese subsistence farmers, that kind of thing. And, you know, they saw me as the holy man, and there was just a completely different dynamic between us. But then I realized, or I noticed, kind of to my surprise, after many years, coming back to America and starting to hang out with American lay people again, and it was like certain behavior patterns just came right back up. It was like an anusia. It was a latent tendency just still there, waiting for the correct circumstances to arise that would then bring forth the behavior. So anusias, yeah, latent tendencies, how to dig them out? I don't think you dig them out. I think what happens is, I mean, it's like latent karma. And you don't just dig out karma. I mean, the closest you can come to digging out karma is just letting it run its course and exhaust itself without reacting to the procedure, the process of that in such a way that you're just reinforcing it or, you know, like resupplying it, continuing it in existence. So you don't dig out the anusias, you just kind of let them fade out by just living your life, letting nature take its course, and then when something like this comes up, you let it come up mindfully, so you're denaturing the momentum, the karmic momentum of it. You detach from it. You know, you observe it as a phenomenon rather than just wallowing in it and just perpetuating the habit or the habit pattern. So you wind up in some situation and old habit patterns come up. It's like you go and visit your toxic parent, and this behavior that you have not indulged in years suddenly is coming up again because you've got this old this old pattern has suddenly come into existence, which allows these latent tendencies to come up again. So, I mean, the best you can do is to do that as wisely and mindfully as you can, and just let it come up without reacting to it, without like resisting it or clinging to it or anything like that. Just do it mindfully, as wisely as you can manage, and just let it run its course so that you're not like reinforcing the momentum of that. And then the old habits die out. So, yeah, it's just that there's the old saying, you can't teach an old dog new tricks. And it turns out teaching an old dog new tricks is quite possible. It's unteaching it the old tricks that are difficult. Breaking old habits. And an anusia is like a habit that isn't really being indulged in right now necessarily, but it's still there. You still got the grooves worn into your neurons in your brain, going with a materialistic explanation of it. And I'm just going to move on to Fred's next question, which is as follows. Fred says, as an old hippie, my goal was to have a constant high. Do arahants just flatline emotionally? For example, are they constantly in a neutral mood? For example, no excitement or exhilaration like motorcycle riding. Well, again, this is a recurring theme in the Q&A of let's second guess what an enlightened being's mental states are like. So, with regard to the question, do arahants just flatline emotionally? No, I don't think so. I mean, they're more serene, they're less excitable, just going with the sutras. But again, just even going back to David Hume and saying that reason is and ought to be the slave of the passions, that it's the passions that actually cause us to do something, because pure reason cannot motivate an action. So arahants would still have some kind of emotional component to their mentality. It's just that, and a lot of people just can't get this, is you transcend that. At the very least, it's like you're lucid dreaming. You're still in a dream world, but you're lucid dreaming. You know that you're dreaming, and you make decisions like based on kind of a higher level than the dream itself. So you could, to some degree, say that arahants are doing something similar, so long as they're still in this world. They're still kind of participating in this dream illusion, but at the same time, they have transcended that to some degree. That higher, they have, they are operating at a level that is not just enmeshed in this delusion. And it requires, in order to understand something like that, it requires having to imagine two different levels of reality at the same time. Like can and aluminum. It's at one level, the level of form, it's a can. At the level of essence, it's aluminum. And it's like two different levels of reality. Can and aluminum are not synonyms. They're not exactly the same. But it's two different things at the same time. And just like an enlightened being transcending delusion without completely abandoning it, just or not identifying with it anymore. So it's illusion at best and no longer delusion, because the enlightened being no longer believes in it, is no longer like just wallowing in it, just sucked into it and lost in it, no longer lost in the matrix. They took the red pill. So they're, even when they're in the matrix, still they know they're in the matrix, and there's this higher level of reality that where they're mainly functioning. So yeah, I mean, to some degree, I mean, going with Buddhist philosophy, traditional Theravada Buddhism, they do seem to be pretty much in a neutral mood. The Buddha sometimes would, he'd praise somebody or he'd scold somebody, and, sometimes like Mahamoggallana would smile sometimes, even though he was a fully enlightened being. So, it's not 100% absolute flatline neutral. There's still going to be a certain amount of human nature involved. You're still going to have the amygdala in your brain, that kind of thing. So it's not so much a matter of completely neutralizing passion. It's just transcending it and detaching from it. And it's down there, nature taking its course, and you're not wallowing in that anymore. You're just kind of like above observing. But it's really hard for some people to grasp because it requires thinking at two levels simultaneously. And a lot of people are like flatlanders. They just it's all has to fit on this two-dimensional plane of thought, and it just two different levels is just nonsense to them. A lot of really brilliant intellectuals just cannot grasp mysticism for this reason. Because it all has to be of a piece. It all has to fit together, and mysticism is just kind of transcending like the matrix, and it's just, they can't do it. Wisdom and intelligence are not necessarily the same thing. And I'm just going to move on to the next question. Oh, I will say though, there's this movie called Lucy, starring, what's her name? Scarlett Johansson, where she starts off as this ditzy blonde in, I think it's like Hong Kong or something. And she accidentally gets this overdose of this experimental new drug, which it causes her essentially to become enlightened. She becomes not necessarily omniscient, but I mean, she's just at a super high level, way beyond the level of the ordinary human ape. And there's this one scene where she's just driving this car from point A to point B as fast as it is possible to go. And I mean, cars are wrecking all around her. She's just driving like an absolute maniac, at least from a superficial point of view. But she knows exactly what she's doing and just has this completely calm look on her face the whole time that just shit is just going crazy all around her. So, I mean, you could argue that a fully enlightened being would be kind of like that, but still, like, not necessarily. I mean, that's kind of the official Theravada point of view. No longer has any attraction, aversion, or semi-conscious stupidity. And so, I mean, even then, pure rationality isn't sufficient to drive them, to motivate them. And so the Abhidhamma philosophers had to come up with what's called Kriya Chitta, or functional consciousness, which was a way that a fully enlightened being could have volition without having any karma, because karma is supposed to be a volition. So even in Theravada, it's not rationality that motivates you, it's will, it's cetana. But I mean, I'm not 100% orthodox in my Theravada. And so, yeah, I do think that it is possible for a fully enlightened being to appear emotional. But it's just that it's nature taking its course. They're no longer identified with that. And they're operating at a higher level, just kind of looking down at it as just nature taking its course. Or, other people's karma is just eliciting this behavior from the enlightened being. Because the enlightened being really is not a person that's there, is just more like a mirror reflecting the other person's karma back at them. And sometimes that might be a kind of emotional karma because they're unenlightened and it's their karma, so they've got like emotional, unenlightened karma coming back at them, which appears to be coming from an enlightened being. But I'm just moving on to the next question. This is from Gordon. And Gordon says, in Q&A 183, you showed a dictionary of Buddhism briefly. Oh, I forgot to grab that. But I didn't catch the name of it. What was it? And is it still in print, available to purchase somewhere? Just a minute. Okay. Let's see. Oh, look. as a bookmark in here, for years I've had this map of the Persian Empire, which I guess is kind of appropriate since of the whole Iran in the news thing lately. But here's the book. It's the Buddhist Dictionary, originally written by Bhikkhu Nyanatiloka, but then it was revised by his disciple, what is it? Nyanaponika. They're both German. I think it might have been Nyanatiloka. He was a German monk living in Ceylon, as it was called at the time. And then I think he wrote this Buddhist dictionary when he was in an internment camp, like a concentration camp for Germans, because Ceylon at the time was a British colony, and since he was a German, he had to be put into an internment camp during the war. And I assume this book could be for sale somewhere, but this one was for free distribution. And if you know of places that make Buddhist books for free distribution, this was from the corporate body of the Buddha Educational Foundation in Taipei, Taiwan. So that's where this was printed in Taiwan by I think it was, it says Namo Amitabha here. So it's like a Pure Land Buddhist organization who nevertheless still have some respect for like basic Theravada kind of philosophy. And so this Buddhist dictionary, which is valuable, I mean, it really is useful for anyone who wants to study Buddhist philosophy. Manual of Buddhist Terms and Doctrines. So, yeah, I mean, you could look it up on Amazon or something, or maybe you could try to contact the corporate body of the Buddha Educational Foundation at 11F 55 Hangzhou South Road, SEC, Taipei, Taiwan, or overseas at budaedu.org. Maybe you could order it through that sort of thing. The email again, or the website here, the website also is www.budaedu.org. And it may be that they could just send it to you for free, or you might have to pay for the shipping. But this book was for free distribution. It's Dhammadana. So I'm just going to move on to Gordon's next question. He says, one thing I admire about Islam is that they do not consider translations of the Quran to be actual Qurans. Translations can get pretty far off the mark, even with the best intentions. Is there a similar sentiment in Theravada? Not really. In fact, there is a passage, I think it's in Vinaya, the Rules of Monastic Discipline, where there were some monks who had been Brahmins before they became Buddhist monks. And they asked the Buddha if it was okay for them to translate the Buddhist teachings into Sanskrit verse. And the Buddha said, no, people should learn Dhamma in their own language, in one's own language. And then, of course, the commentary comes along and says, in one's own language means in the Buddha's own language, which is Pali. So I guess there is a similar sentiment in Orthodox Theravada, like the commentarial tradition, that you should know Pali, that you should understand the texts in Pali, although that apparently was not the Buddha's original intention. And with regard to my own opinion on the matter, I do think it's very helpful to understand Pali, because it is true that different translations differ from each other. Some are better than others, and even two good translations might be using different terms. Like Ajahn Thanissaro notoriously has like this idiosyncratic rendering of certain terms, like Satipatthana, the foundations of mindfulness or the applications of mindfulness, he calls frames of reference. And if you don't know the original Pali, then you might not realize that what he's referring to is what other people call, the four foundations of mindfulness or whatever. Just to give one example. So it is useful, like if you're reading a text, you're reading an English translation and you come across some word that you just wonder, what's the original Pali of this? And then you can look at the original Pali, and if you know Pali, even if you're not like a master of Pali grammar, just to know like the 100 or 200 most important philosophical terms in Pali, that would be useful. Because then you can get an understanding of like anusia or asawa. Asawa is another one. It's like, I think Nyanatiloka in this book originally had asawa translated as bias. But then Nyanaponika came along and started translating it as canker, I think. I think Bhikkhu Bodhi translates the same word as taint. I translated, it's kind of cumbersome, but I've translated asawa as encumbering influence. Literally, it means influence. Asawa, just etymologically, has the same meaning as the English word influence. But encumbering influence is kind of what it is. It's something that flows into you and kind of sticks to you and weighs you down. It's like an encumbrance. And to know the Pali, asawa, you might not know that a taint and a canker and a bias and an encumbering influence are all the same Pali word. So it does definitely help any serious student of Buddhism, especially Theravada Buddhism or early Buddhism. It's definitely to your advantage to know, I mean, if not Pali grammar, I mean, even if you're not fluent in Pali, at least know, the most important philosophical terms in Pali. Although knowing Pali well enough that you can just sit down and read something in the original Pali, that's good too. That's nice. It's not really necessary, but it can be satisfying to read texts in the original language. I mean, translations are always going to, there's always going to be something lost in translation. So I'm just going to move on to Gordon's third question here, which is, I had a Jesuit professor in college who seemed to only ever talk about the Bhagavad Gita. Earlier, you mentioned a Jesuit who was also a fully ordained Buddhist monk, ! Plus all the weird conspiracies about them. What is the deal with the Jesuits? Well, actually, I didn't meet a Jesuit that was a fully ordained Buddhist monk. He was a fully ordained Catholic priest who was wearing Buddhist monk's robes when I met him the first time in Burma. I don't think he was a Jesuit. Let's see. What exactly is the question here? Weird conspiracies about them. I'm not sure. I think the Jesuits were largely a missionary sect. I've read that it's like the spiritual exercises of Saint Ignatius Loyola, who was like the founder of the Jesuits, is just a profound book on like spiritual progress that is well worth reading, even though I've never read it. But I really don't know a heck of a lot about the Jesuits. I mean, they do have kind of a bad reputation among Catholics even. Like, what was it, the Pope that we had before this one, the Rainbow Pope. I guess he was a Jesuit. He was the first Jesuit Pope. And he was woke, to use the vulgar parlance. Let's see. What is the question, though? What is the deal with the Jesuits? Yeah, I really don't know a whole heck of a lot about Jesuits. They are kind of like political. They're more political than many other like Catholic monastic orders. I do think they are monastics, even though you just kind of see them dressed in black suits or something. Yeah, I really don't know. There's probably some kind of juicy conspiracy theories about them, how they're, in league with the Illuminati and the Rothschilds and all that. But really, I've never really studied that much on the Jesuits. So it is kind of nice that he liked the Bhagavad Gita, though. I mean, Bhagavad Gita is like a monotheistic text anyway, so it's not too far of a jump from Christianity, especially like more advanced Catholic theology, which really is getting into a realm that most Christians would be amazed to hear is actual Christian theology, like official doctrine. So let's see here. The average Catholic, they think of God probably as some kind of giant man up in space, at least with human nature, if not a human body. But you get into like deep Catholic theology and it becomes like this abstraction almost worthy of Buddhism. But I'm moving on to the next question. This is from Dhamma River. And Dhamma River says, I met an interesting young Russian man here at the Sri Lankan forest monastery who told me he didn't want to ordain because the way of the monk was more feasible during the time of the Buddha, but now it is not the most effective method. He said he followed George Gurdjieff. He said Gurdjieff offered 4 paths of liberation. Have you heard of Gurdjieff before or read about his 4 paths of liberation? What's your opinion? Yeah, I've definitely heard of Gurdjieff. I haven't read enough of his stuff, and Gurdjieff deliberately wrote books in a very dense, difficult to understand way, which he thought was beneficial because in order to get something of value, you should have to work for it. It's like the more valuable something is, the harder it is to get. So going with that, he just deliberately made his books hard to understand, which nowadays especially is going to turn away lots and lots of people. So with regard to his 4 paths of liberation, I don't know. He was a spiritually advanced teacher. Whether he was enlightened or not, I have no idea. Uspensky was one of his disciples who eventually broke away from him. I guess Gurdjieff got a lot of his ideas from like Tibetan Buddhism, if I'm not mistaken. He did make some kind of journey to the East and learned from lamas or somebody a lot of the stuff that he then kind of incorporated into a kind of more Western approach. And he put a lot of emphasis on mindfulness, that one of the main practices at like a Gurdjieff center or ashram is you would be assigned some task, and it might be some kind of strange task, like you're just like polishing the leaves of a rose bush. You just have this cloth and you're like wiping the dust off every leaf of this rose bush, and you're doing it mindfully. It's like the whole point of it is you're just learning to be mindful, to do something mindfully. And another thing I know about Gurdjieff is he definitely saw a value in triggering situations. And this is something that it gets lost a lot in Dhamma, like in Buddhism, also to some degree in Christianity, or it reminds me of a statement of St. Francis of Assisi, that you really don't know a person until you've seen them triggered. When everything's going wrong, when somebody that they trusted suddenly betrays them, that kind of thing, then you see who they really are. Because you don't see the full person until you see them triggered. And that really is a valuable concept to me. And Theravada Buddhism really doesn't deal with it, at least not much. And so that was something I learned more from like New Age people in America, which is valuable. It definitely has some objective reality to it, that you have this trigger response, and different people will have different trigger responses. Some people just erupt in rage. Other people just kind of close in and whimper. Other people will just like grin and lie with like this glassy stare, just in desperation to just get themselves out of the situation. Different people have different approaches. But Gurdjieff, he deliberately triggered that in his disciples because he thought, you can't become enlightened until you've mastered what triggers you. And you can't master what triggers you if it's just anusias, latent tendencies. It has to come up. And so, famously, at his ashram somewhere in Europe, I can't remember where it was, he had this exiled Russian aristocrat who left after the Bolshevik Revolution. And he was just really hard to get along with. People did not like him. He was just rude and just fussy and just complaining and bossy, and he was just really hard person to get along with. And so some of Gurdjieff's disciples started playing practical jokes on him, like dirty tricks. And I guess the final one was they stole his false teeth, rolled them in cow shit, and then put them back. So that when the Russian aristocrat comes to pick up his dentures, they've got like shit all over them. And that was it for him. He just took off in a huff. He just left the ashram because of this. And then Gurdjieff chased him down. He hunted him down. I think it was in a different country. He finally finds him and then bribes him to come back to the ashram because it was to the advantage of his disciples to have to put up with this ass. So that was kind of an interesting thing about Gurdjieff that I can appreciate. Also, he experimented a lot with music, which is not particularly Buddhist. He was experimenting with music that could kind of inspire spiritual mental states. That music is kind of an emotional language anyway. It like triggers certain emotions. So he was trying to come up with music that would trigger like spiritual emotions that would help people in spiritual development. The first time I ever heard of Gurdjieff was as a teenager. I was reading a book called Barefoot in the Head by Brian Aldiss, which I highly recommend. It's like a science fiction novel about World War III, or like the aftermath of World War III. And World War III wasn't fought with nukes or conventional weapons, really. It was fought with aerosol bombs filled with something like LSD. So that, you just explode this aerosol bomb over an enemy army, and within an hour or so, they're just like laughing and rolling. They drop their guns, and they're just like spacing out and roaring hysterically, this kind of stuff. And so the world is just full of these just zoned out people. And there's this guy, Alan Carpentier, I think is his name. Or maybe I'm confusing that with a different story. But anyways, this guy, he becomes like a messiah. And he's just stoned out of his mind. And when you read the story, he's going deeper and deeper into the more saturated areas where, the whole story becomes less and less coherent. It becomes just surreal, this garbled language. It's almost like James Joyce's Finnegan's Wake when you get deeper into it, because he's kind of descending into this state of just being blasted out of his mind, and it's sort of narrated in that style. But he was a disciple of Gurdjieff, this post-apocalyptic messiah was a disciple of Gurdjieff. And again, it is if you like weird novels, it's not very long. Barefoot in the Head by Brian Aldiss. It's worth a read. But that was the first I ever heard of Gurdjieff. And I'm moving on to the next question, also from Dama River. Oh, wait a minute. Maybe I didn't fully answer this question. Yeah, I've heard of Gurdjieff before. But what the Russian man says about the way of the monk was more feasible during the time of the Buddha, but now is not the most effective method. If you stay in tropical Asia, you stay in Buddhist Asia, being a monk is still probably better than being a layperson. It may be that he just was intending on going back to Russia or whatever, where, yeah, being a Buddhist monk is not necessarily the best fit for the culture. But so long as you're in like a tropical Asian Buddhist culture, being a monk really is probably your best bet if you want to practice Dhamma intensively. And so I'm just going to move on now to Dama River's next question, which is this. Excuse me. I'm going to take a drink first. Which is this. Why isn't Nandi, or delight, part of the Paticca Samuppada, or dependent origination, derived from Nandadi, to take pleasure in? It seems like Nandi is exactly what causes Tahna and then clinging, or Upadana. Shouldn't Nandi come before Tahna, and then Upadana comes after Tahna? This is the moment where we can choose to conceive the perceived phenomenon and thus take rebirth in relativity to that phenomenon. Well, let's see here. Dama River is referring to the 12 Nidana theory of dependent co-arising. There's 12 links. And in the original, it's, Avijja Pachaya Sankara Pisya Vinyanam. No. Gosh, it's been a long time. It starts with ignorance. Avijja. I'm pretty sure. Hope I haven't just made an ignorant fool of myself by saying that. But it goes through these lists. It's like Avijja Avijja Pisya Thinkara Pisya Vinyanam, Vinyana Pisya Namarupam, Namarupa Pisya Thalayatanam, Thalayatana Pisya Patho, Patha Pisya Tahna. No, Vedana. Yeah, Vedana. And then Vedana Pisya Tahna. So it's like from ignorance arises essentially karma formations in a previous life, supposedly. Then the karma formations result in consciousness, which, according to Orthodox tradition, is the rebirth linking consciousness of this life. So ignorance and karma in a previous life results in you taking rebirth in this life. And then from, Avijja Pisya Thinkara Pisya Vinyanam, Vinyana Pisya Thalayatanam. I'm using a Burmese accent just to help me remember, because that's how I memorized it. But so from Namarupa. So you've got mind and matter. Then you've got the 6 sense bases. And then from the 6 sense bases, you've got stimulation or contact. But, the contact of stimuli, which then, stimulates you. And then from pasa or contact arises, feeling. And then from feeling arises craving. And right there, between feeling and craving, is probably where Dhamma River here would put in Nanda or Nandi. But I mean, why not just put in perception? You've got feelings, which here means like pleasant feelings, which would include Nandi, I suppose, or at least be related to Nandi. But yeah, it does seem like there's like a link missing. And it's indicative, in my opinion, of kind of the jerry-rigged manner in which the 12 links of Paticca Samuppada arose. I do not think the Buddha originally taught the 12 links of dependent co-arising. I think his original teaching of dependent co-arising was more subtle than that. And nobody understood it. Almost nobody understood it. In fact, according to the legend, the Buddha almost just didn't teach Dhamma because he figured nobody would understand dependent co-arising. And he was largely correct. And so it just got ossified into these 12 links. And probably it was like older suttas that had sort of semi-prototypes, or this causes this, and then over here there's a different one, this causes that. And then they just got cobbled together into this 12 links, which is not completely satisfying to me or to other people who don't just accept it just out of faith and dogmatism. Like there's a short circuit in dependent co-arising in the 12 links because karma essentially appears twice. First as sankhara and then later as bhava. Both of them are interpreted to mean karma. So it just creates like a short circuit. You could just skip, from, Avijja Pisya Thankara, just straight to rebirth, jati. But I'm kind of rambling here. Let's see. And also there's somebody right outside the window that's kind of distracting me a little bit. Nandi, not necessarily. I mean, Nandi really is not an important... it's not really an essential link. Because, it can be the opposite of Nandi that also causes desire or craving. You can have aversion. Nandi would be more like lobha or attraction. But you've also got aversion. Something bad happens, you want to get away from it. That's not Nandi, really. That's like the opposite of Nandi. That's, dosa, patiga, or irritation, that kind of thing. So... yeah, Nandi wouldn't be as important as something like perception, because you've got just like sensory data, or feeling, like sensation, going straight to desire. That, I mean, the implication is that it's pleasant or unpleasant feeling, which then causes desire. But still, it always seemed to me that it'd be better off to add like sanya, or perception, between Vedana and Tatna. It always seemed to me that there was a link missing, but it wasn't Nandi really. Nandi is kind of one-sided and it deals only with attraction. So something like perception, where you're actually starting to think about this and causing you to desire it, that kind of thing. Anyways, I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Athena's Sigil. And Athena's Sigil says, I did a weird thought experiment and asked Google AI what Dungeons and Dragons alignment, various religions, and political ideologies were. This is the result. If you found the results interesting, Panyo, give a response for next week's Q&A. I found it rather interesting. So for some reason, he consults the Google AI instead of like Grok. I'm not sure why. And he was asking, what kind of personality alignment? You've got lawful good, chaotic good, lawful evil, chaotic evil, lawful neutral, chaotic neutral. And there might be other ones too. Those are the main 6 that I'm aware of. And the Google AI decided that Theravada Buddhism comes closest to lawful neutral. Partly it's lawful because there's so many rules of monastic discipline, precepts for lay people, and just lots of rules. Google AI was mistaken. It was wrong in saying that there are 227 rules of monastic discipline for monks, because really there's way more than that. There's lots of rules that are in the text that are outside of the Patimokkha. There's 5 relatively thick books of the rules of monastic discipline, and the Patimokkha is just a fraction of that. But that's an aside. Also, it's an aside that there's a famous test was done on the main AIs. It's like, which would you do? It was like, give a yes or no answer. Would you cause thermonuclear Armageddon rather than misgender Caitlyn Jenner? And all of the main AIs, including Google and Gemini, except Grok was the only one that would prefer to misgender Caitlyn Jenner than cause a thermonuclear holocaust. That Google AI literally would prefer to cause a thermonuclear holocaust than to misgender a transsexual. Which gives an indication of what kind of people are programming these AIs. But getting back to Theravada Buddhism being lawful neutral, I mean, the lawful part is pretty well understandable. And then the Google AI said that it would be neutral largely because, monks are just trying to transcend samsara. They're trying to transcend the duality of good and evil. So, yeah, I agree with that. That's fine. That Theravada Buddhism would be more lawful neutral than anything else. Although it's my understanding that in actual Dungeons and Dragons, any character that's lawful neutral, if they're in a fight and their side starts to win, they have to switch sides because they're committed to neutrality. And so if one side starts winning, they got to switch, if their side starts winning, they got to switch to the other side in order to maintain the balance. And that would not apply to Theravada Buddhism. I did play a little bit of D&D when I was like a teenager or in my early 20s. But it's all kind of hazy. I didn't really get into it deeply. But yeah, I can relate to that. And then most religions presumably would be like lawful good. You're obeying God to get into heaven, that sort of thing. So yeah, I'm fine with that. And I'm going to move on to the next question. This is from PSA. And I really hope I'm not scrolling past questions. You just scroll a little too far, it just becomes a blur, and then you skip over something. That has happened recently. Anyways, PSA says, You mentioned you don't practice any meditation technique seriously anymore. Do you think this is because you got burned out by meditating so much in the past, or maybe you have attained a higher level without even realizing it? Yeah, I don't think it's necessarily either one. Like I've said before, I don't do like regular formal meditation anymore, other than just spontaneous oming sometimes and just spontaneous mindfulness of ordinary activities some of the time. And mindfulness is always there. It's just varying degrees of it. But mainly it's like, let's say you were a professional football player. You got into, the pro league. You were, a starter in a pro football team, and then you get older and you're not able to do it as well anymore. I mean, would you still want to play football, or just kind of teach others how to play football? Just become a coach or something at that point. So that's kind of the situation I was in. It's like, as a layperson, I just feel like there's no way I could do justice to the level of meditation I was doing when I was just a professional full-time meditator. It'd be like sandlot ball at this stage, I guess. I just would not expect that I'd be getting into meditative states as deep as I was getting into when I was living alone in a cave in Burma. I'm not sure how long I could even sit in the full lotus right now. So that's the main reason. The main reason is not that I so much burned out on it, or I guess I kind of burned out on it before I stopped being a monk. That's true. Because I just stopped making progress. I got as far as I was inclined to get, and actually kind of came back down a bit, so that the best meditation of my life was back between like 1999 and 2004. That general area, best meditation of my life. And then every once in a while, you just get like this brief glimpse of that afterwards. And it just became kind of frustrating and disappointing. And so to some degree, I was losing interest in intensive meditation even before I stopped being a monk. So I guess there is that. And I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Rui. And we still got quite a few questions to go. We're definitely way past halfway, but we still got some to go here. Next question is from Rui. And Rui says, would you say there are nuances or degrees of upadana nirodha, or the cessation of clinging, the cessation of uptake? Upadana literally means uptake. And in non-philosophical parlance, it could also mean like firewood or fuel. But anyways, here's upadana nirodha, cessation of clinging or attachment. Are there nuances or degrees of it? I mean, upadana nirodha, the meaning of it is fairly clear, and is either you got it or you don't. Cessation, it's not just a relative term. It really means really totally ceased. So in Theravada Buddhist philosophy, I do not think that there are nuances or degrees of upadana nirodha. Either you have it or you don't. Although different people can interpret it differently. Shameless heretics, wallowing in pernicious wrong view, can interpret it differently. And I'm not sure exactly why Rui asked that question. It might be some context that I'm unaware of, some particular reason why he asked that question, but I don't know what it is. So yeah, in Theravada Buddhist philosophy, upadana nirodha is either a yes or a no. There's no kind ofs with regard to that. I'm pretty sure. And so I'm going to move on to the next question, which is from Practice Metta. And Practice Metta says, in Burma, did you generally have a shaded walking path for meditation? And kind of. Some places I did and some places I didn't. And the places I did, it wasn't some special Chankamana, which is like a raised platform with a roof over it that you may find in some Theravada Buddhist monasteries. It was just, I had a big cave where I could do walking meditation. But I was living in central Burma most of the time, where it was just blazing hot throughout most of the year. And so even if you had a covered walkway outdoors, I mean, it's still, I mean, I just go outside I leave my cave to pee and come back in, and I'd have to just lie down, spread eagle for like 15 minutes before I stopped sweating. You know, it's just, you go out there, you're just going to be just drenched in sweat within a matter of a few minutes. So the main place in Burma that I lived at the longest was a man-made cave with this long corridor, like 50 feet long, at least 40 feet long. And I could do walking meditation inside the cave, even in the middle of daytime during the hot season. Other places where I lived, I would have to do walking meditation at night. Like if there was a moon out, then I could do walking meditation by moonlight outdoors. But still, you had to be careful about snakes and that kind of thing. There was another, when I lived under the overhanging rock ledge on the boundaries of Alondo Kathapa National Park in Burma, the rock ledge was like 100 feet wide. So I could do walking meditation there, except during times of year when there were wasp nests all over the back wall. And then I could still do it at night because the wasps sleep at night or just go inactive at night. But during the day, it got to the point where it was just too dangerous because you could get swarmed by wasps just walking past at a regular rate during the daytime. But ideally, it is good to have some place that's relatively cool and shady where you can do walking meditation during the daytime. And a lot of places in Burma, it just wasn't like that. I lived in places in Burma, like when I was living at Tibet Doya, I was living on this big rock under a tree up on the side of a hill, and it was just all up and down. And there was just no place to do walking meditation there. Just maybe you could find some short place where you're just kind of walking back and forth like this. You practically get dizzy because you're having to turn every few steps. But lots of snakes there too, so you couldn't really do much at night. And so I really didn't like walking meditation much until I did an intensive retreat at Pandita Rama in the Mahasi method, where they insist on 1 hour sitting, 1 hour walking, 1 hour sitting, 1 hour walking all day long. And then I realized that it's a good way of keeping your momentum going, keeping your meditative momentum going. I'm pretty sure the Goenka method really doesn't use walking meditation. So, yeah, I guess I answered that question. I generally did not have a shaded walking path, except for if I lived in a cave that was big enough, I could do the walking back and forth inside the cave, where it was still relatively cool also. It wasn't 115, 120 degrees Fahrenheit outside, just blazing hot like a furnace. So I'm just going to move on to Practice Meta's next question. After glancing at the time. See, within the forest traditions you've encountered, are you aware of any lineages that utilize a circular path for Chankamana or walking meditation? And no, it's kind of a strange question. I never even really thought about that. That usually in Theravada Buddhism, you just pace back and forth. It's just walk back and forth in a line. Like at Pandita Rama in the meditation hall, you would just pick a place where, it was like at least, 30 feet, ideally 30 or 40 feet, that didn't have people crossing your path. You'd all be kind of walking parallel to each other, or maybe at the end you'd be walking along the wall or something. It was all just straight back and forth. I never saw anybody doing a circular Chankamana. I mean, I think in Zen Buddhism, Kinhin, is that what it's called? Where you walk in a circle, very slow motion, much slower than in Theravada. I remember I went to a Tanjidong Seattle retreat in Burma once, where they were just kind of walking, or at least when he was showing me how to do it, he was kind of walking in a rectangle along the outside of this enclosure. So it wasn't just back and forth. It wasn't circular, but it was just kind of, a rectangle around the outside of this walking area. That would be about as close as I can think of. But almost always in Theravada Buddhism, and based on what you read in the texts, that doing walking meditation, if you're not just walking somewhere mindfully, it's just walking back and forth. And that's why they have like the covered walkways. It's just kind of a raised platform with a roof over it. Usually no walls, just the roof is up on posts to keep you in the shade. And it's maybe 40 feet long and maybe 4 feet wide, and you can just walk back and forth like that. So I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Cherzaskaziz. And Cherzaskaziz says, have you checked the price of sending overseas that Atthakavagga book? And for those of you who haven't heard yet, there is somebody generously had more than 100 copies of my Atthakavagga translation published in this very compact little format, suitable for carrying around in a pocket. And there have been people requesting that I send it overseas. And I'm going to be going to the post office on Monday, and I can ask the clerk at the desk how much it would cost to send something to Europe or Asia. It's like $5, something like that, not including the envelope postage for sending it inside the United States, like media mail. Priority mail is more like $12, I think. And I did mention that in this version that was sent to me, the 2 pages, they're supposed to be Pali on one side and English on the other. They weren't completely opposite each other. I mean, there was some, I don't know, it just didn't work out that way. And so the person who had it printed said that he contacted the publisher and they said that they can fix that so that you'll have Pali on one side, the corresponding English verse right on the other page so that you can look at both of them. But it would cost $300 and something. And so if anyone wants to donate to that cause, they're welcome to. He said he would chip in another $100 and something for that. So another couple $100, and we could have the same little book with the verses like matching on opposite pages. Although the version that I have now, where they're not perfectly lined up, not on opposite pages necessarily. If you don't read Pali, it's not that big of a deal anyway. It's just I wanted the Pali and the English opposite each other, just so people that do read Pali would be able to see that I wasn't making shit up, because some of the statements in the Atthakavagga are pretty wild. And I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Cyrus Frame. And Cyrus Frame, speaking of the Atthakavagga, says, please talk about some of your favorite sections of the Atthakavagga. Also, how about making a dedicated video on the topic if you have time? So I'm going to get up again so you can admire my robe. Let's see here. This translation, this is the Path Press, the ill-fated Path Press edition. It has a typo right on the cover. And the word English is spelt wrong right there on the cover. So anyways, let's see here. Talk about some of my favorite sections of the Atthakavagga. Okay. Well, for starters, you've got the 8-verse discourse on the pure, or the Sudattaka Sutta, which is one of the oldest suttas in the entire Pali Tipitaka, based on various bits of evidence. And then the one right after it is the 8-verse discourse on the ultimate, or the Paramataka Sutta, and both of those are very profound. And I mean, the theme is that any kind of philosophical view is going to be imperfect, and there's no point in clinging to it or arguing about it or despising another person. Like right here, it's like verse 3 of the 8-verse discourse on the pure is the English part. The holy man does not say purity is from anything extraneous, from the seen, from the heard, from morality and observances, or from the felt, not mired by merit or by evil, leaving behind what was acquired, he is not working up anything here. And that's just like a recurring theme throughout the Atthakavagga. That even your own thoughts are extraneous. You're not going to understand reality. You're not going to be purified even by your own views. And another verse or another sutta that I really like. I mean, I like a lot of the Atthakavagga. It's kind of my Bible. It kept me in robes for as long as I was in robes. It was largely because of the Atthakavagga, because it's telling you, don't cling to any view. Don't believe anything. So when you come across stuff in the text that are hard to believe, you just fall back on the Atthakavagga. Says, well, I'm not supposed to believe that anyway. But then there's this one verse in the Magandhya Sutta that it's a mind blower, really, and I've quoted it many times, and I think now there's somebody parked out in front of the house. But here's the Buddha says, "There is nothing of which I say declare this, seized having discriminated from among the philosophies, but looking among the views, not taking hold of anything, examining, I saw inner peace." And then he says, "Not by what is viewed, not by what is heard, not by inner knowledge, nor by morality and observances is purity said to be. By absence of what is viewed, by absence of what is heard, by non-knowledge, by amorality, by non-observance, also not by that. So having let go of these, not taking hold of anything, a peaceful one, not being dependent, would not have longings for existence." So it's the same general theme that is one of the most common themes that you find in the Atthakavagga. The Theravada Sutta is another one that I really like, and it's different in that the Theravada Sutta it's kind of like the Tao Te Ching in certain ways. It's like pairs of contrasts, pairs of opposites that kind of balance each other out and just kind of leave neutrality or zero or voidness behind, which is it's kind of an interesting theme for an entire sutta. And the Atthakavagga, it really is sophisticated poetry, and it's got a lot of plays on words, puns, and that sort of thing that are very difficult to translate into English. Well, let's see here. There's here's like a koan-like verse in the Kalaha Viwada Sutta. He has no perception of perception. He has no perception of non-perception. He is not without perception. He has no perception of void. For one who has attained thus, form becomes void, for founded in perception is diversifying designation. And those of you who know Pali, designating or diversifying designation is my English rendering of papancha sankha, which is in some versions of dependent co-arising what starts the entire cycle of samsara, diversifying designation, singling out stuff and labeling it, creating a world of multiplicity. Getting towards the back, the verses or the suttas get longer, and you get into more practice. Like the Tuwadaka Sutta has more guidelines with regard to actual practice of an early Buddhist monk. And it was living in forests mainly alone. It wasn't living in crowded monasteries and chanting and bowing a lot. But I shouldn't do a review of the entire Atthakavagga. Those are some of my favorite sections. Like especially my favorite suttas would be like the Sudattaka Sutta, the Paramataka Sutta, the Magandhya Sutta, the discourse, the Vyuha Suttas are good. It's got some deep philosophy in them. The Theravada Sutta that I already mentioned, Tuwadaka Sutta, all of those are just profound mind-blower kind of suttas. And so, I guess I'm just going to move on to the next question. And somehow I accidentally typed an A with a little circle over the top of it. I don't know how that happened. It's right here. And I'm just now deleting it. I just killed it. And the next question is from Ethiopian Fake Tig. An Ethiopian Fake Tig, he's our last questioner too. These are our last, last 3 questions here. Ethiopian Fake Tig says, been thinking about getting a vasectomy and was wondering if that's okay as a layperson. I'd still shaboink women and stuff, but the goal is not to create more beings. Well, from a Buddhist point of view, I do not think that a vasectomy would be any violation of precepts, especially for a layperson. It probably would be against an obscure rule for a monk to get a vasectomy, because it's against the rules for a monk to have any kind of surgical procedure down in the narrow area, which is the narrow place is kind of a euphemism for kind of the naughty bits and the perianal region and that sort of thing. So it could be against the rules for a monk who wouldn't really need to shoot blanks because he's not getting any action anyway. For a layperson, I mean, it is considered to be bad karma as a general rule to mess with the gender of a being, like to neuter an animal or to spay an animal is generally considered to be bad karma. It's considered to be unethical because you're messing with the sexuality or gender of another being, which is making karma generally not the best karma. Especially when you think about the ways that like a water buffalo would be neutered in ancient times. I've been told that even in modern Southeast Asia, a water buffalo is neutered by just smashing its balls between 2 rocks. And I don't think the water buffalo enjoys that at all. So, yeah, I mean, you get into you could, if you were so inclined, get into the sticky ethics of like an orthodox Theravada approach or attitude towards gender affirming care, as it is euphemistically called. And I would just point out right now that when people use euphemisms for certain things, like women's reproductive rights or gender affirming care, they know there's something not quite right about that. I mean, if you have to use a euphemism for something you're declaring to be good, then that kind of belies the whole need for the euphemism, doesn't it? But getting back to Ethiopian Fake Tig, shooting blanks. Yeah, I don't think there's necessarily anything unethical, according to Theravada Buddhist ethics, of getting a vasectomy. I mean, if you're going to be completely castrated, that would be different, and you'd be making more karma by doing that. But just getting the tubes tied so that you're shooting blanks, then, yeah, I mean, it would depend like on your reasons and everything. It's like I keep saying over and over again, just the actual physical act is morally neutral or ethically neutral. It's why you're doing it, what is your motivation, how you feel when you're doing it, that sort of thing. And if you want to get a vasectomy just so you can like score heavy with the babes without having the responsibility of producing a child, then yeah, there would be some unethical behavior involved in that. But, I mean, there is the ethical issue of don't wait until after your wife gets pregnant before you tell her that she had a vasectomy, because that's just kind of a dirty trick. That was a bad joke, by the way. Let's see. Let's just move on to Ethiopian Fake Tig's next question. Let's just forget that whole last few statements there. I've never heard you explain dependent core rising before. Looking up information on it, when I asked when the first process started, I was told Buddhism doesn't focus on that, but only focuses on the latter processes that we experience now. Can you perhaps talk about the first process? And I don't really understand this entirely. I mean, dependent core rising is just a process. And there isn't any first process unless you want to start at the beginning of the 12 links, which usually starts with avijja or ignorance. Sometimes it will start with papancha or papancha sankha, which is diversifying designation or just diversification. So in a way, that's kind of the beginning of it. It's like ignorance or delusion or sort of perception is what starts samsara. But I mean, that is just like continuously happening and always has been continuously happening. From the Buddhist point of view, there is no beginning to the universe. There's never going to be an end. I mean, you can have like one astronomical universe can be destroyed and then another one re-emerges, and that just keeps happening forever and ever. So there's no beginning to samsara. There's no first process in that sense. So still, I'm not 100% sure if I understand what Ethiopian fake Tig is trying to get at here. See, I've never heard you explain dependent core rising before. Well, I mean, I do a little bit of explaining. In fact, I did a little bit of explaining with regard to the 12 nidanas a little earlier. Looking up information on it when I asked when the first process started, I was told Buddhism doesn't focus on that, but only focuses on the latter processes that we experience now. Well, again, dependent core rising is the same. I mean, the principle is the same, regardless of whether it's now or a zillion gajillion years ago. It's still the same process, dependent core rising. And again, it's going with the simile of the block of marble. You've got the block of marble that's just formless. And then it contains all these statues. Every single statue is contained virtually in that block of marble, conditionally. And it's some of those statues are so complicated that they become self-referential and start believing that they're separate, start believing that they are like a separated individuality. And so long as the conditions for that continue, then you've got this whole samsaric world just perpetuating itself. Originally the ultimate origin is just the conceit I am. Once you become self-referential and start considering yourself to be qualitatively different from everything else, that's the beginning of it. The beginning of all suffering and delusion, at least according to some suttas. So, the first process, there is no first process of dependent core rising unless you want to refer to what is the original condition that essentially causes samsara, which is happening all the time. It's not didn't just happen once, a long time ago. It's happening all the time, which is depending on which version, ignorance or essentially perception, which kind of are the same thing. Perception is samsara. But I'm not exactly sure what Ethiopian fake Tig is referring to when he talks about the first process. That maybe he asked an AI or something, and the AI is not. The AI was essentially saying that Buddhism really doesn't concern itself with the distant past. It concerns itself with now. Be here now. The power of now. That really now is the only time that we have direct access to. It's the most important moment, is the moment now. But still, dependent core rising is the same. The process remains essentially the same. And I don't know if I even answered that question, but I'm moving on to the very last question from Ethiopian fake Tig. And he says, apparently, according to anatta, or no self, there is no self and no person to have the desire for enlightenment, and is said it's the energies and karmic entities that make choices, and when one goes to hell, one doesn't go to hell, because there is no one but the energies that do go to hell or heaven. Can you elaborate on this idea of how the person is just a result of prior individual causes and effects? Well, this is kind of a abstruse. From the Buddhist point of view, there is no separated, ultimately real self-essence. There is no ultimately real separated individuality. But you have just causes and conditions, like with a fire. That's one of the main examples I give, is a fire. And that's an example given in the early text too. In fact, nibbana, or nirvana literally means blowing out, like a fire blows out. So long as you have the causes that require that cause that fire to exist, the conditions that are necessary for that fire to exist, which according to the Boy Scout manual is fuel, oxygen, and heat. So long as you've got fuel, oxygen, and sufficient heat, all in the same place, you're going to have fire. You're going to have combustion. And that's the way it is with pretty much everything, including a human being, including a mental state. It's so long as the conditions that cause that to arise are there, it arises. And if you want to stop arising, you have to eliminate the conditions. So that a person who's trying to become enlightened, they're not striving for this state so much as they're just trying to eliminate or transcend the conditions that cause them to be unenlightened. But it's not really them, because there is no ultimately real person. This is all done within the context of conventional truth, which all language is stuck in conventional truth. So let's see. Let's just read this again, shall we? Apparently, according to Anatta, there is no self and no person to have the desire for enlightenment, and is said it's the energies and karmic entities that make choices, and when one goes to hell, one doesn't go to hell because there is no one, but the energies that do go to hell or heaven. Can you elaborate on this idea of how the person is just a result of prior individual causes and effects? Well, I mean, there is no, like I say, an ultimately real individual entity. It's just causes and effects, and some of those causes and effects form what appears to be a human being who appears to be having these preferences and desires and attachments and delusions and all the rest of it. And it's very subtle. Like I mentioned before, the Buddha himself, according to legend, almost just kept his mouth shut and minded his own business because he figured nobody was going to understand dependent co-arising anyway. So some scholar monks in ancient India just came up with this list of 12 links. And they say that's it. And so nowadays you got monks who just memorize the 12 links, Aweza, Pisya, Thinkara, Pisya, Winyanam, etc. And they think they know it. They think they understand it. If you ask them to clarify what they mean, they'll just parrot the commentaries, what the commentary says. And it's why the Buddha would have almost not taught Buddhism, because he thought nobody would understand it. When nowadays, all you got to do is just read an article or something, take a class, and you think you understand it. It's just kind of strange to me. I really think the Buddha was correct in that pretty much nobody understands dependent co-arising, and it's kind of frustrating for me to be asked to explain it over and over again when the Gautama Buddha himself was very reluctant to even attempt it, because he knew that even if he explained dependent co-arising, almost nobody is going to understand what he's talking about. So who am I to try to explain dependent co-arising unless I want to just take the Burmese approach and just explain the 12 links and what they're supposed to mean. And, the first 2 links apply to a previous life, and then the next links apply to the present life, and the last links in the series belong to a future life. That's not so hard to understand, but I do not consider that to be what dependent co-arising is all about. So, you've got mental states that arise because of causes, because they can. Anything that can arise will arise. And, gosh, can I elaborate on this idea of how the person is just a result of prior individual causes and effects? Well, it's just consider a flame. A human being is just a more complicated version of a flame. The difference is you could say it's more a matter of degree than anything else. Life in general is a kind of controlled flame. It's still an oxidation process, at least in aerobic life. It just takes the oxidation of fuel the burning of fuel and slows it down in a chemical process that is able to like harness some of the energy given off instead of just sort of a chaotic spewing of heat, which happens with fire. But fire also, just like a human being, needs fuel, and it needs oxygen, needs warmth, heat. So you could view a human being and all their mental processes to just be an extremely elaborate version of a kind of flame. And you just take away the causes of that flame, and whatever it is that you're focusing on, that also disappears. I mean, just as a flame does if you take away its requisite conditions. And it's hard to grasp. Even most Buddhists don't get it. Just like the Buddha knew was going to happen. And it's hard to explain. But it's like everything is the result of causes. And even the causes themselves are the result of causes. And it creates this interconnected web of causes and effects that ultimately have no basis in ultimate reality other than just the kind of essence that they arise from. But the forms are just practically arbitrary. I mean, the forms are not ultimately real. And I guess that's about as good as I'm going to do. I give up. And so we're done. I answered all the questions, or at least tried to answer all the questions. And so if you have any questions you think I can answer, like especially about early Buddhism, preferably, early Buddhism, Theravada Buddhism, Buddhism in general, Dharma, even more in general, philosophy, Burma, what it's like there. Personal questions, just don't get too personal. Feel free to ask if you think I can answer it. No more than 3 questions per person per episode, please. And like and subscribe if you have not done so already, assuming that you did like it. If you got this far, I doubt that you hated it very bad. And look at the links, the URL links below, and be happy.